Hello, I'm Arielle Selya, and I'll be talking about selective reporting, confirmation bias, and spin in published scientific articles. By way of disclosures, I work at Pinney Associates, and we consult to Juul on tobacco harm reduction. First, let's start with a basic ethical principle. Scientists have a moral duty not only to conduct research in an honest way, but to also accurately convey their research findings. Each week, I help Clive Bates with his review of newly published research articles from PubMed on nicotine and tobacco. These articles cover a wide range of topics on behavior, which is what I'll be focusing on today, as well as toxicology, chemistry, and so on. In doing these reviews for a while now, I've seen many types of errors, enough that there's different patterns or types of errors. There are too many categories to describe today, so I'll start out with what I don't have time to cover today, and that is fundamental errors in analysis, how study design and analysis decisions can bias the results, and how study findings are misreported, misunderstood, or misrepresented in translating from the scientific research to the media. Since there's already been a lot of focus on those categories of errors, I'll be focusing today on a slightly different category. I'm going to ask you to accept, for the sake of argument, to temporarily assume that each paper's results are accurate and free of methodological errors, and also to evaluate each paper in a self-contained way. So ignore whether or not it's consistent with other studies on the same topic. Even with these assumptions, these very generous assumptions, there's another category of error, which is a mismatch between those results and the narrative in the paper. So even assuming the results are accurate, these are recurring issues that I'm seeing that involve selective reporting, confirmation bias, and spin. I'll be focusing on 2 behavioral articles from 2023 alone that show this type of error. I'll go through how a reader would potentially understand the article from the narrative and the policy implications stated in the article, and then I'll wrap up with some things that we might be able to do about this. The first example is a study on nicotine dependence and biomarkers. The study aim was to examine dependence and biomarkers of nicotine exposure among youth in the era of high nicotine e-cigarette products. This was an analysis of Pathway 5 data among 14 to 17-year-olds and 18 to 35-year-olds who exclusively used e-cigarettes, so they didn't use any other tobacco products. The analysis compared those who use Juul brand versus those who use other brands versus overall. We'll jump straight to the conclusions of this paper, since that's what many readers do when they read the literature. The correlation for Juul vapors, the majority of whom were under 21 years of age, was equivalent to that of previously reported for cigarette smokers. This suggests that the introduction of high nicotine e-cigarettes is associated with increased nicotine addiction in U.S. youth. This conclusion gives a reader the impression that Juul and other high nicotine products are just as bad as cigarettes in terms of the overall levels of dependence. But let's look at the results that are meant to support this conclusion. This table is the only results table presented in the paper, and this shows the association between biomarkers and nicotine dependence. The betas are regression coefficients, and they show how much the biomarkers in terms of total nicotine equivalents increased for every 1 unit increase on the Wisdom nicotine dependence scale. The claim in the conclusion about equivalence between Juul and cigarettes is based on this correlation value R, which I derived from the values reported in the table. For Juul, this is 0.46, which is similar to what's been previously reported in a different paper for exclusive cigarette smokers. However, the big missing result is, what are the overall levels of nicotine dependence and biomarkers? A stronger association doesn't mean that the levels of the variables are high. So this is not saying, for example, that Juul users have higher dependence or higher biomarkers than users of other e-cigarette brands. You can have a strong association where the overall levels are low on average, or a weak association with overall high levels of the variables. Nowhere in the paper do they present the overall levels of dependence or biomarkers. But we have reason to believe from other studies that dependence on Juul tends to be lower than dependence on cigarettes. All we know from the presented results is that the dependence measure, whether it's high or low, is moderately correlated in the case of Juul, or weakly correlated in the case of other e-cigarettes with nicotine biomarkers. So returning to the conclusion, I note that some of the language is careful to refer to the correlation rather than the levels, which I highlighted here in yellow. Whether the average reader understands that this is an association and not the levels is a different story, especially since it's not stated what the correlation is with. but at least the language is somewhat careful. However, the final statement in the conclusion claims increased nicotine addiction, which explicitly refers to the level of dependence, not its association with biomarkers, which was never reported in the paper. Even if the results did show that the levels of nicotine dependence were equivalent between Juul and cigarettes, that only establishes equivalence, not increased nicotine addiction. That would require comparing prevalence, which was not done. Overall, the conclusion is largely unrelated to the actual analyses presented. The second case is a study examining ENDS flavor appeal across adult participants with different tobacco use status. Participants either currently use cigarettes and/or e-cigarettes. They came into the lab and had a one-puff trial of different flavors and rated how much they liked it. Analyses compared difference between the following groups based on their tobacco use status. Jumping straight to the conclusion of this paper, e-cigarette sales restrictions on non-tobacco flavors, including menthol, may eliminate products preferred by adults who vape, including those who never smoked, without discouraging adults who currently smoke and never vape from trying e-cigarettes. The implication here is that we should ban all non-tobacco flavors because that will deter uptake among never users without hurting adults who smoke. This obviously has important implications for regulating flavors because it seems from this conclusion that there's only a benefit and no costs. Let's look at the results that are meant to support this. Since there are many different results, I'm color coding here just to help match up the results and conclusions text with what's presented in the tables. Starting first in yellow, the results text says that there's higher appeal for non-tobacco flavors overall in adults who never smoked and currently vape. This is directly supported by the results in Table 2, which show that non-tobacco flavors versus tobacco flavors are associated with higher appeal by 13.6 points on a scale of 0 to 100. Again, assuming that this is an accurate result, this does support the conclusion in yellow that restricting non-tobacco flavors may eliminate products preferred by adult non-smokers. Now in green, the results say that appeal was not different by flavor for adults who currently smoke and never vape. Again, we see that this is directly supported by Table 2, showing that there's no difference in appeal between non-tobacco flavors and tobacco flavors among this group. So again, this does support the conclusions in green that there's likely no unintended harm of restricting flavors among adults who smoke and never vape who might benefit from switching to e-cigarettes. So far, the results generally match the conclusion, although I'll return to the B coefficient later and what that actually is telling us. However, I only showed a snippet of Table 2 before. Here's a fuller snippet of Table 2, importantly showing the other tobacco use status groups. I've highlighted the results for each group that didn't seem to make it into the abstract results. In pink are the adults who formerly smoked and currently vape. This includes people who already successfully switched from smoking to e-cigarettes. And highlighted in blue are the adults who currently smoke and currently vape. These might include people in the process of switching. Both of these groups also show significantly higher appeal of non-tobacco flavors compared to tobacco flavors, by 11.6 points on a 0 to 100 scale for those who formerly smoked, and 9.3 points for those who still currently smoke. So the totality of the results do show negative unintended consequences in terms of lower appeal of tobacco-flavored e-cigarettes for those who might have already switched and might be at risk of relapsing, and for those who might still be in the process of switching. Returning to the B coefficients and what they actually tell us, just like in the first paper we covered, it's important to keep in mind that these are associations, not actual levels of appeal. The paper, in fact, does not present actual levels of appeal anywhere, which makes me wonder whether the same pattern of results holds at that level. These associations are adjusted for socio-demographics, detailed smoking history and current use, detailed ENDS use history, current use, and dependence on each. However, I'm not sure that makes conceptual sense. For example, what does it mean to adjust away smoking history when estimating the association between flavor and appeal? Overall, it's unclear whether or how the overall levels of appeal differ by smoking history, and whether they would still support the abstract's conclusions that there's a benefit in deterring uptake among non-users, while having no unintended effect among adults who smoke and have yet to try e-cigarettes. Summarizing the second paper, the authors did, to their credit, examine potential unintended consequences, but those results were largely ignored in the narrative. In thinking about giving the authors the benefit of the doubt, I thought maybe they ignored these groups because they were small and maybe perhaps weren't relevant when scaling up to a population level. However, that's not the case. The two groups of adults who smoke who might suffer from a flavor ban were just as large as the group with no apparent negative impact. So I don't see an objective reason for excluding those unfavorable results in the abstract. Ignoring those two groups means that the abstract focuses only on the potential unintended consequences among adults who have already been demonstrated that they're not interested in e-cigarettes because they haven't used them yet. These unintended consequences are briefly discussed in the paper but then dismissed. For example, in the case of adults who used to smoke and now use ends, they call into question the value of vaping long-term anyway, saying, well, these people shouldn't be vaping long-term. It's not in their best interest, followed by a call for additional research. Overall, the conclusion is fundamentally at odds with the totality of presented results, although what's presented selectively is backed up by some of the results. These are just two examples of many. What can we do about this? First, I'll discuss some preventive measures. Ideally, peer review should have caught these errors before publication. Maybe peer review did have some effect by forcing the complete set of results to even be included in the paper, even if it didn't quite make it into the narrative. And I know that there are some successes here. For example, a colleague's peer review of a pro-gateway paper, they were able to request more analyses to be added that balanced out the narrative. Obviously, peer review doesn't catch everything, so one area for peer reviewers to focus on going forward is to really ensure that the conclusions are supported by the underlying results. This is especially true for the abstract, since many readers, myself included, sometimes only read the abstract and trust that to give a comprehensive view of what the paper found. Some other general good practices, which may or may not have prevented the errors discussed today, are things like pre-registration, which is becoming more encouraged and even required by journals. This can help to cut down on p-value hacking and selective presentation of results. Also, the Addiction Ontology project can help to standardize some language and improve precision, so it's clear what a paper means when it uses certain phrases. There's also a movement towards expanding the definition of conflicts of interest to include other funding types other than industry, such as from NIH or Bloomberg. There's a case to be made that even non-industry funding is also a legitimate conflict of interest because there might be pressure to conform to the funder's position, and research positions and salaries are in part dependent on the funding. Unfortunately, as we can see from the published literature, we can't expect these errors to be entirely prevented. When preventive measures don't work, there are some reactive measures we can take. Perhaps the most traditional one is formal correspondence through a journal. There are some success stories here. Criticism of methodological flaws led to 2 papers purporting to show negative health effects of vaping being retracted. However, that's not always an option, and some journals are censoring critical comments, especially if the journals have an anti-industry policy. Fortunately, there are some more opportunities these days for open access criticism. For example, PubPeer and Chaos are both platforms where criticism of published papers can be posted. There was one success of this. A Chaos review led to a major correction on a relative risk estimate that ends are 30% as harmful as cigarettes. The paper was then corrected to say, we're really not sure. However, the majority of PubPeer or Chaos criticisms don't result in any changes of the original paper. Science Media Center is also very helpful at getting experts' takes on high-profile papers, whether it's critical or supportive. A final strategy is to publish meta papers that highlight common flaws in the literature and establish best practices. There are a few different papers that I would put into the category that I list here. In conclusion, I broke down 2 articles from 2023 alone where the presented results are fundamentally at odds with the stated conclusions. This is an issue even when accepting that the presented analyses are true and considering them in isolation from other studies. Both studies selectively reported results that supported stricter regulation of e-cigarettes while ignoring the opposing results. The conclusions are not fully supported by the results presented. This likely presents confirmation bias at work. There's also spin of the results to support the narrative, such as conflating the correlations between the variables with the overall levels of those variables. Brandolini's law, or the bullshit asymmetry principle, applies here, because these papers will continue to be cited based on their stated conclusions, but it takes a lot of effort to explain why they're not supported by their underlying results. Peer review might prevent some of these errors, but still misses many. Once it's published, an article can be used to justify policies, even if it's later retracted. Fortunately, there are increasing opportunities for post-publication review. Although most of them do not result in anything being changed about the actual study, there are some important successes. I'll end with a call to action. Please consider doing your part towards promoting a culture of accurate and balanced research, whether that's as a researcher, a peer reviewer, an editor, or even just as a reader and consumer of the science. Thank you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions using the contact information below.